Hello and welcome. Tonight we are reading strange stories, which are all first-hand accounts taken from the website Your Ghost Stories. These stories will all follow a common theme, and in addition to reading the stories, we will also read interesting comments and discuss relevant topics of folklore and whatever else comes up. The theme for tonight is Harbingers of Death. Harbingers is a word I'm uncomfortable with, because for some reason I think it should have a V in it instead of a B, and I'm not sure why. But a harbinger of death is a concept that provokes a fair amount of unease, most likely because they are directly tied to death. Many of us fear the idea of death. It's unstoppable, unknowable, but creeping ever closer. Unless you've been extremely close to death, most of us can't fathom what it'll be like once it finally comes, or how it will come. A harbinger of death tells us that the end is coming soon. They appear in different forms, some of them quite unusual. The authors of the stories we are going to read tonight have experienced these harbingers firsthand, so let's get into them, shall we? Our first story takes place in Australia and was submitted by Geetha50. It's called My Australian Experience. This story happened when the author was in Sydney for a cousin's wedding. They wrote and recounted the story just days after it occurred. Here's what they had to say. My cousin and her husband arranged for my family to stay at a rented apartment complex. The apartment was located in Woolloomooloo City in the Bondi area. It was in the perfect place, about a 2-minute walk to the mall and about 20 minutes from Bondi Beach and the Opera House. I had the unfortunate luck of getting my period the Monday we arrived at the apartment, and I had really bad lower back cramps because of it, so I was getting up 2 or 3 times during the night. This incident happened the Saturday night after my cousin's wedding. We were all back from the wedding. I was finally out of the uncomfortable sari I had to wear, and everyone had settled down for the night. I slept like a baby as soon as I lay down, but I woke up again at about 2:30 a.m. I slowly went to the washroom with my back cramps, then came out and decided to make a cup of tea so I could relax a little bit before I went back to sleep. Soon after I filled the electric kettle with water and set it to heat, I started hearing this low jingling sound. I knew it wasn't the kettle because I just set it, and you would hear a click sound when it was done. My second thought was that someone's cell phone was going off, so I went to each room to find the source of the cell phone and/or other electronic ring, but found none. My third thought was that my brain was probably still in a sleepy fog, so I was hearing things. I went back to the kitchen and made my tea, and then went to the living room, where I decided to watch a movie on my laptop while drinking my tea. At this point in time, not only did the jingle sound get louder, but I also heard the sound of horse hooves, and it sounded like it was right outside the building. I looked around to see that nobody had got up, not even my uncle, who was a light sleeper and was sleeping on the floor in the dining room area. I got up from the sofa and went to one of the windows in the dining room and looked outside. This window faced the side of the building where the main entrance is. Next to the building is a connected pathway, park, then beside that is a Catholic primary school. I looked out the window to see nothing, but I still heard the jingling and hoof sounds really clearly. I was about to look away and wake my uncle when I saw a black horse-drawn carriage come into the park next to the building and stop beside the main entrance. When I say black, I mean everything was black. The 2 horses were black. The carriage, which was in an old Victorian style, was black. And above all, the guy that was driving the carriage was dressed in all black. Thinking back, I never saw any of his features, but just felt that he was a man. The outside stairs lead to the main entrance, and then once inside, there are 2 sets of stairs. One leading to the apartment that we were renting for the week, and the second one leads to the apartment that was rented by an elderly lady for many years. In the time we spent at the apartment, we got to know the elderly lady, and she was a healthy 80-year-old woman. The guy on the carriage stayed there for a minute, and then got off his carriage and opened the carriage doors. Within 30 seconds, the neighbor lady came out of the apartment and headed to the carriage. Just as she was about to get in the carriage, she looked around at me and waved. I don't know if I waved or not because I thought I was going to a state of shock at what I was seeing. The difference in the neighbor was that she was not in her formal dress that she usually wears, and she wasn't wearing her hat. Also, she had a small mark on her forehead. The neighbor got into the carriage, and the carriage drove off, and when it got to the other end of the park, it disappeared. I must have been sitting there for about 15 minutes when my uncle woke up and asked what I was doing up. I told him my back was hurting, and that was why I was sitting on the bench. My uncle told me to go to sleep because everyone was going sightseeing the next day. I turned off the laptop and went to bed without drinking my tea. I was the last one to wake the next morning, and I woke to the ambulance leaving. I was informed that the elderly neighbor had slipped and hit her head on the dining table. The owner of the building had come to collect the rent in the morning, and when nobody answered and the dog was barking, he opened the door with the master key to find the lady dead. It was then I realized what happened last night. I told my family what happened the night before, and the first person to react was my aunt. She took me to the nearby church and blessed me, and told me that what I saw was the death carriage, and prayed over me to make sure that nothing happened to me or the family. Beautiful story, and I imagine very spooky to behold. The carriage that Geetha described strongly resembles the death coach of Irish folklore. I would try and pronounce the Irish name for you, but I know I would butcher it horribly. But W.B. Yeats describes it in Fairy and Folk Tales of Ireland as an immense black coach mounted by a coffin and drawn by headless horses. It will go rumbling to your door, and if you open it, basin of blood will be thrown in your face. So sometimes the horses who pull the carriage are said to be headless, as is the driver of the coach. This creature is called a Dullahan, who, Yeats says, is a most gruesome thing. He has no head or carries it under his arm. Often, he is seen driving a black coach drawn by headless horses. It is an omen of death to the houses where it pauses. In one village I know, its rumbling is said to be heard many times in the year. It's said that once the death coach has come to our realm, it cannot leave empty, symbolizing the inevitability of death. If the death coach exists outside of the Irish culture, I couldn't really find any examples. It's interesting that the author of the story saw this carriage and had no idea what it was she had witnessed until she heard about the neighbor's death the next morning. Geetha has a ton of stories on Your Ghost Stories and posted on her profile that she was born in Sri Lanka and raised in Canada in the religious tradition of Hinduism. So it doesn't seem like the death coach would be a part of her culture, and indeed she had no recognition or knowledge of it until her aunt informed her of the death coach. So why did the death coach appear? Perhaps it was part of the neighbor's set of beliefs. Maybe she had Irish ancestry in some way. Irish people have been integrated in the Australian population throughout history, and in current day, a considerable amount of Australians claim at least partial Irish ancestry. So I just think it's interesting to ponder why the death coach appeared. Anyway, all in all, a very interesting story and a fascinating piece of folklore. While we are on the subject of Celtic folklore, let's read the next story. It's by Welshman Trezise, and it takes place in Wales. Forgive me in advance for butchering the Welsh language. The story is called Gwrach Rhibyn.
This is a story about the Gwrach Rhibyn, the harvester of the dead in Wales. When I was young, I remember in the countryside of northern Wales, near Blaenau, Festiniog, someone was very old in our village and was expected not long to last. One cold and foggy night after our harvest, I went to bed, and very late at night I felt cold and saw my breath inside the house, even though there was a fire going in my room. I heard footsteps outside, like hard wooden shoes on the old stone road, so I looked out my window and I saw an old woman, clad all in black and a black wide-brimmed hat, passing my house and continuing down the street. I was curious. Why would anyone be out at this time of night, especially an old frail woman? I was going down the steps to go out the door and ask the hag why she was there, when my older sister grabbed me and took me upstairs and locked the door. She closed all the curtains and shutters and said I had to go to sleep. As I peeked out the window, I saw everyone else's shutters were suddenly closed and all locked up. The next morning, a man had been found dead in his bed, expected to have died that night. I never wondered until now quite why my mother and sister had hidden me away and closed up in such haste, when I figured out it was the old Gwrach Rhibyn come to collect the old and failing man in death. Since then I have had more run-ins with this creature, but that is a different story.
The beautiful voice you just heard is my dear friend James Gracie, who is a native Northern Irishman. If you enjoyed hearing his voice, he is also featured on a reading we did of Shirley Jackson's The Man in the Woods. You can also read his reviews of horror films on his website Behind the Couch, which I will include a link to in the description. He's contributed to dozens of publications on the subject of horror and is the author of 2 books. Back to the story we just heard. The Welsh name for this creature and the story translates to the Witch of Rhibyn, so I'm going to refer to her as such from now on so I don't subject you any further to my terrible Welsh pronunciation. If you are familiar with the Irish banshee, the Witch of Rhibyn isn't that different. It's essentially the Welsh variation of the myth. Folklorist Wirt Sykes says in his 1880 book, British Goblins, the spectre is a hideous being with disheveled hair, long black teeth, long, lank, withered arms, leathern wings, and a cadaverous appearance. In the stillness of night, it comes and flaps its wings against the window, uttering at the same time a blood-curdling howl and calling by name on the person who is to die. It is always an omen of death, though its warning cry is heard under varying circumstances. Sometimes it appears in the mist on the mountainside or at crossroads. Sykes includes an encounter told to him by a man he met in 1878 who was visiting a friend the previous year in Cardiff. He said, "I was sleeping in my bed and was woke at midnight by a frightful screeching and a shaking on my window. It was a loud and clear screech, and the shaking of the window was very plain, but it seemed to go by like the wind. I jumped out of bed and rushed to the window and flung it open. Then I saw the Witch of Rhibyn. Saw her plainly, a horrible old woman with long red hair and a face like chalk and great teeth like tusks, looking back over her shoulder at me as she went through the air with a long black gown trailing along the ground below her arms. For body, I could make out none. She gave another unearthly screech while I looked at her. Then I heard her flapping her wings against the window of a house just below the one I was in, and she vanished from my sight. But I kept on staring into the darkness, and as I am a living man, I saw her go in at the door of the Cow and Snuffers Inn and return no more. I watched the door of the inn a long time, but she did not come out. The next day, it's the honest truth I'm telling you, they told me the man who kept the Cow and Snuffers Inn was dead, had died in the night." The man goes on to say that the witch seems to follow old Welsh families, and the same is true for the Irish banshee. It explains as much in the book Folklore and Folk Stories of Wales by Marie Trevelyan. Welshmen say this night hag never troubles new families, only those whose ancestors have long generations lived in the same place. In other words, the old stock. Sometimes one of her eyes is gray and the other black. Both are deeply sunken and piercing. She was sometimes seen with long flapping wings that fell heavily at her sides. Frequently, the flapping of her leathern bat-like wings could be heard against the window panes. She goes on in her book to describe how the Witch of Rhibyn is known to haunt the castles and estates of old Welsh families. Let's move on from Celtic folklore for now. It's one of my favorite subjects though, so I could go on and on. Our next story was written by Sassy Mama 85 in North Carolina. It's called Man in the Brown Suit. I work in a nursing home, and due to HIPAA regulations, I will not include names or my location. We have a ghost man that is seen during periods of death. What I mean by periods of death is usually we have residents die in sets of 3, 6, 9, and occasionally 12. It's unfortunate and scary, but when our resident angel of death, that we refer to as the man in the brown suit, is seen, I can't help but get an extremely uneasy feeling. Sometimes he is seen by the person who passes, but usually he is seen by persons who do not. He is always described as a male, with white hair, wearing a brown suit, hat, and tie. The residents that see him are very frightened. Normally, he simply passes by their room and looks at them. Occasionally, it has been reported that he comes out of the closet, or the wall, or simply been sitting in a chair in their room. Once, he asked a resident what the time was. Another time, a blind woman described him in detail. I would not have believed it had I not already heard the stories. He is seen during all hours of the day, but more often at night. However, every time he is reported as being seen, someone passes away. Nurses and CNAs have seen him as well. They see him walk into a room, but then he is gone when they investigate. I personally have seen a shadow in the corner of my eye, but it disappears when I turn to look. For that I'm thankful, because I do not want to see him. I would probably quit. I just wonder who he is and what he wants. It's creepy. I'm not sure if it is him or not, but sometimes call lights will go off by themselves, and once a bed started raising while I was changing a resident without me pushing the button. Perhaps it is more than one ghost. I don't know if I personally have anything to add to that story. I just found it to be really interesting, well told, and spooky. I've always found hospital ghost stories to be intriguing. Hospitals are such a strange place energetically. People are always coming and going. Health is improving and declining. People are being born and dying. The door is constantly revolving. Let's take a look at some of the discussion in the comments section. Elfstone810 asks, "You said that the residents who see him are frightened. Are they frightened because they know his appearance presages a death, or is he just scary by himself? How far back do his appearances go?" And the author responds, "A friend of mine has worked there for 11 years and heard about him when she started, so I'm not sure. The facility is around 35 years old. I don't think that the people who see him know that a death follows his appearance. They are just frightened." I want to clarify though, residents do not always report his appearance before someone passes away. However, any time he is reported being seen, a death follows very shortly after, usually within hours. Valkyrie Cry says, "I don't know if this is related, but your story sounded a bit familiar to me. And then I recalled that both of my older sisters, both retired RNs, had told me similar stories about the hospitals where they had worked. One had worked in a VA hospital, and she said many claimed to see a visitor at odd hours, right before someone passed. The other had worked at a Catholic hospital, and there it was said that an old nun in full habit would pass through." The question is posed again and again, pondering if the man in the brown suit is an angel of death, or a spirit who appears to dying people to guide them over the threshold, or does his appearance cause the death in some way, as in, is he a nefarious entity? The author seems to uphold the opinion that the man's intention is not to frighten, only to guide or to signal. However, it seems that not all those who see the man in the brown suit are set for death. Paper Doll says, "I know this was posted years ago, but I had to comment that I've seen him as well. One night I woke up to go to the restroom and he was standing right beside me by my bed. Brown suit and like a brown derby looking hat. I haven't seen him since, but if he's going to help me with my ability to know when others are going to die, I have a knack for it anyway, then I welcome him to come back." Another commenter, Helsinki, says, "When I was a small child, I had an imaginary friend who was a man wearing a brown suit with a brown derby hat. I didn't think anything of it until I mentioned it to my family, and they didn't think it was normal. I've always been able to see ghosts and whatnot, but it never occurred to me until the last few years that maybe my old imaginary friend was actually a ghost. Interesting. Well, whatever he is, I am fascinated by the tale of the man in the brown suit. There's one more comment I'd like to read that will segue us into our final story. Lucky Me says, I also work in a retirement home, and deaths happen in threes. And you're right, it is pretty eerie. I've heard of people knowing when they were about to pass and seeing some kind of apparition, but the man in the brown suit is different. Earlier in the story, the author mentioned that deaths in the hospital seem to happen in multiples of 3. And this last comment we read says that this happens in the retirement home they work in as well. I, too, have heard that deaths happen in 3s. 3 is the magic number, and it seems to have some affiliation with death. Our last story is by D. Unknown and takes place in the Philippines. It's called 3 Knocks of Death. I'm an introverted guy and a nocturnal one. Due to having no work, I got used to sleeping during the day and being fully awake throughout the night, spending my time playing on PlayStation or on the computer. One night, after midnight, all of a sudden, there were 3 knocks on my door. The knocking was very clear and loud. I thought my mom was awake and wanted something from me, so I opened the door and to my surprise, no one was there. So I just brushed it off and continued what I was doing. After a few hours, I heard the knocking again. I opened and still no one was there. This incident happened a lot of times over the next couple days. Sometimes weeks would pass until it would occur again. I called up a friend who was studying at the University of the Philippines and asked him about these knockings. What he told me scared me at first. He told me that the 3 knocks were a sign of death. I asked him what to do. He told me not to open the door if it happens again, unless someone called my name. So, a death doesn't seem to follow the knocks in that story, but it does affirm the old superstition of the 3 knocks of death. I couldn't find an origin to this legend, but the general idea is that if you hear these 3 knocks, perhaps on a wall or a door, then it is signaling an upcoming death, though not necessarily your own. There are lots of things that are said to signify the approach of death. These are known as death omens. Here's an entry for death omens in the Element Encyclopedia of Ghosts and Hauntings. In folklore, a death omen is a sign of an impending death. Every culture has its own unique death omens. Death is frequently foretold by the appearance or behavior of certain animals, insects, or birds associated with the afterlife. Blackbirds, crows, owls, ravens, rooks are often thought to be death omens when they appear in a village or cluster around a house. The howling of a dog or a black cat crossing the path are also thought to be signs that portend the death of someone nearby. Spiders are often associated with death, and according to American, British, and European lore, the death watch beetle, which makes a ticking or tapping sound during the summer months as it bores into wood, is considered the harbinger of a death in the family. Death omens can be natural occurrences. For example, the way wax drips from a candle, or accidents, such as a chair falling over backwards as a person gets up, or signs of nature, such as cloud shapes or star formations. They can also be supernatural occurrences, such as candles and lights that flicker in the night, or the appearance of an apparition, such as the banshee, or a phantom coach with a headless coachman, or spectral black dogs. Black dogs is a subject I will definitely go into one of these days, but another time I'm going to dedicate a whole video to that. So, as you can see, a death omen or a harbinger could be almost anything, and we've only touched on a few harbingers of death tonight. There are many more, and lots of them are Celtic in origin, for a reason I'm currently unclear of. But let's bury our discussion of death for the evening. Death and its importance may be spooky, but it is one of the most natural processes in our mortal world, and it's not an end. only a transition, a transmutation of physical body, certainly, but of spirit, who knows? It's not for us to know, but it sure is interesting to ponder. Thank you so much for joining me tonight, and until next time.